the radiation level climbed from 3.5 microsievert per hour to 30. The highest reading was on the ocean side of the building that houses the number 3 reactor. It was over 1,300. Radiation levels remain high. We only stayed there for an hour. By comparison, for example, the background radiation level in New York is between 0.05 and 0.25.
So it's quite high. Now, ultimately, the utility will have to dismantle the reactors. What kind of work is going on now at the plant?
At this point, the most important task remains to cool down the melted fuel inside the damaged units. The fuel could be as hot as a 1 megawatt heater. It's similar to heat emitted by 1,000 electric stoves in a small space. If these units aren't kept consistently cool, another meltdown could happen. Spent fuel rods are also stored in all the reactor buildings. The other important task is to remove them. And this fuel also produces heat, so it has to be kept cool in a pool filled with water. Spent fuel must be cooled until it becomes stable. Work had already started at the number 4 unit. It houses the largest amount of spent fuel, and it's the easiest area for workers to access, since this reactor didn't melt down. TEPCO plans to start the removal process in November. Once the spent fuel is removed, it will be transferred to a fuel pool built above ground. But the pool is not big enough to store all the spent fuel. So TEPCO plans to build a new facility that relies on helium instead of water as a coolant.
How long is it going to take to remove the fuel and dismantle the reactors?
TEPCO aims to remove all the spent fuel by 2021. The next step is to remove melted fuel from the reactors. They plan to finish that by 2036. The entire procedure will take until 2051. That is 40 years after the accident.
What are the major obstacles?
Let me highlight the 3 major issues that must be addressed. The first is to develop robots that can operate under high levels of radiation. The second is to make sure there are enough workers with sufficient skills to complete the job. The third is to dispose of the radioactive materials, including contaminated water, debris, and fuel. Beyond that, I think it's also important to consider the decommissioning process as a valuable experience. We must share what we learn from this process with the international community. It's going to be a long journey. We need to keep a close eye on the work to make sure the right steps are taken and that information is shared. I'll keep you updated.
All of the work that had been done with robots to try and sort out Chernobyl showed that it's impossible to use robots because the problem is that the electronic systems that robots work on cannot sustain, they cannot function when the radiation fields get too high, because when radiation impinges on a substance, on any material, what it does is it creates electrons. That's why it's called ionizing radiation. It's absorbed by the material, and it ionizes the material, which means that it kicks electrons out of the material. Now the problem is that robots work on electrons. Your computer works on electrons. All of these chips, all the electronic chips that people use all work on electrons. I mean, you can't have a system where the electrons are just randomly being kicked out all over the place, because ultimately the whole thing gets scrambled. And that's what they found in Chernobyl. And they tried everything. They tried the Germans had some very fancy robots, and then they tried robots from somewhere else, and they built their own robots, and none of the robots worked. They worked up to the point where they got into the high radiation fields, and then they just went mad, went around in circles, and sort of fell off the side. That's why in the end in Chernobyl they had to send men in. They called them bio-robots, and they just called up 20,000 men from the reserve army lists, and they put roofing lead around them and sent them in to pick up this stuff by their bare hands and throw it over the side. And of course they all died.
Workers have begun removing debris from an area in northeastern Japan that's been off limits for more than a year. They're cleaning up wreckage from the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. The debris remained untouched because of radioactive contamination from the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Government officials had designated some coastal areas in the city of Minami-Soma as being inside a 20-kilometer no-entry zone around the nuclear plant. They lifted an entry ban last April in some areas, but it took 10 months for authorities to obtain residents' approval to create a temporary storage site for the debris. Workers have now begun sorting more than 20,000 cubic meters of wreckage into burnable and non-burnable substances. Crews will take the burnable debris to the temporary storage site where it will be incinerated.
I'm really glad that they are finally starting to clear the debris. I think it's a first step.
I've received a lot of requests to get rid of the debris as quickly as possible. We will work hard to remove all the debris as soon as possible.
Environment Ministry officials say they hope to complete the cleanup in other areas in Minami-Soma by March next year.
The Fukushima catastrophe is probably the worst nuclear disaster in human history. It's certainly worse than Chernobyl. The contamination from Fukushima has gone as far south as Tokyo. I have measured it personally in air filters from cars. At least 12 different air filters from cars were sent to me, some of them from the south of Tokyo, and many of them from 100 kilometers away from Fukushima. And they contain very large